Hello, everyone. This is Chapter 9, Racism and White Supremacy. I will give you a heads up. This is kind of a tough chapter in terms of talking about race, some in-your-face sort of concepts. And as a European American, you may not be used to hearing these terms. And I don't want you to dismiss it as racism. Often the conversation about whiteness gets interpreted as racism, as I said before. It's okay for America to talk about black, because when we think about black, we think about prejudice. When we think about diversity and multiculturalism, we think about a black and brown or a person of color. And really, in order to have a more sophisticated conversation to talk about race, we need to think about whiteness. Because often, as European Americans, people don't think about them terms in terms of a race. They say, I don't see color. Whiteness is not race. Black is a race. Hispanic is a race. And Indian and Asian, they're a race. But whiteness is not a race. But that's not the case. It is a race. But we need to have more sophisticated conversations. So I wanted to give you a heads up as we talk about racism as white supremacy. So just some basic definitions I wanted to start out with. Whiteness, the property or quality of being white in color. So this is a sort of basic definition, common sense definition, a landscape dominated by the whiteness of snow. So that's the reality of it. No European American person is actually white, if you will. But definition number 2 really gets into what we are thinking about in terms of the notion of whiteness, the fact or state of belonging to a human group having light-colored skin. And whiteness looks different in different parts of the world. So a person in, for example, South America, Uruguay, for example, the country of Uruguay, a person that is considered, quote, white would look almost what we would call Hispanic in the United States. But it is consistently about having light skin. I have a friend that is half African American and half Taiwanese, and so her skin comes out as just a little bit darker. What in the United States we would call, in the African American race, light skin, very fair skin. But when she went to Thailand, she was made fun of because she had dark skin. And so there's no logical way of talking about whiteness. It is completely sociological. We ascribe meaning to it. Whiteness was defined as both a racial and regional characteristic. It has been still today. And I included this cartoon here that I thought you might find interesting in terms of change and what are we going to do about the problem of racism. So you see the first group, who wants change? European Americans usually say, I want things to change. I want to see things different. We want to combat racism. But often when people have to go out of their comfort zone and do something different and actually have to change, nobody raises their hand. That's a stinging indictment, but it's true. I want to do something about racism as long as I don't have to change, as long as I don't have to come outside my comfort zone. And then furthermore, all the onus in racism is usually put on people of color. That's problematic. Folks of color have to do all of the heavy lifting, and that shouldn't be. White versus whiteness. White as a term describing people refers to light-skinned people of European descent. You notice how you use the term European American. I think I talked about that before. Whiteness refers to the construction of the white race, white culture, the system of privileges and advantages afforded to white people in the U.S., across the globe, through government policies, the media portrayals, decision-making, corporations, schools, judicial system, etc., and so forth. Colonialism is linked to the legacy of white supremacy, and we'll talk about white supremacy a little bit later. It's the control of one nation by transplanted people of another nation, often a geographically distant nation that has a different culture and dominant or racial ethnic group. So you see it throughout history. Americans have been known for being imperialists, but particularly Britain. So, for example, when Britain came over and colonized America, and begin to impose their laws on us in the 1760s, we begin to the 1770s, we begin to rise and rebel against that colonial power. Well, Europeans have colonized Africa in particular. That's one of the major pieces. Also, major places. Also, South America. That's why when you go to Africa, you'll see people that speak French. That's not their native language. You'll see people that speak English, like in Ghana, for example, is the predominant language. In parts of Africa, as I said, speak French. That's because the French colonized that particular region. So you see the picture there. Often when people go to places like Africa or South America with black and brown folks, they take pictures and of these tribal people, and there's the mindset that the European Americans have gone over to rescue them from themselves because they're so backward and pagan. That's a white supremacist attitude. That's a racial superiority attitude that European culture is better and somehow more superior than the poor black Africans. And just talking about some things that's real. I know you're not used to hearing this discourse, but I'm trying to tone it down a little bit because I want to also say I'm all about unity. I really am. I don't walk around indicting people because they're white or advancing my particular culture because it's so superior. I don't believe in ethnocentrism. That's the idea that one race is superior over the other. But these kinds of classes expose dangerous thinking of racism and prejudice. So anti-racism. So furthermore, anti-racism deals with the active process of identifying and eliminating racism by changing systems. So systems include like how schools are done, how we do curriculum, how scholarships are disseminated, how government policies are implemented, organizational structures, policies, practices, and attitudes, eliminating that, the racism. So systemic racism that would disenfranchise folks from getting into leadership positions. And you see I have these notes here on the side there. Tolerating racism is racism. So if you sit there and tolerate the jokes, or if you tolerate unjust hiring practices, or tolerate unjust housing practices, and you say, I can't do anything about it, yes, you can. If you just tolerate it and don't even try to research it and don't think about it, and then that's the type of racism. Racism stops with me. And so at least in our sphere of influence, what can we do? Again, my belief system, my worldview champions love. So I operated from a position of love and unity. I really do. I'm not a divisive person. I really want to see races come together in real collaboration. And so that means also I have to expose the racism and the division that's perpetuated by the legacy of white supremacy. So, and speaking of white supremacy, a lot of people think that white supremacy is relegated to the pictures you see below, the Klan, the neo-Nazis, white pride movement, etc. and so forth. You see this a lot in the prisons with the white youth gangs and things. But that's not necessarily white supremacy. White supremacy is the idea that white people are superior to all other races, especially the black race, and should therefore dominate in society. That means the notion that white people are smarter, so therefore they should be presidents. They should be president of the United States. They should run companies. They should run schools because they're not biologically smarter and they're better. And that's white supremacy. So what is whiteness? And we've been talking about this already. Refers to the specific dimensions of racism that elevate white people over people of color. Basic rights, resources, experiences that are assumed to be shared by all are only available to whites. White power and privileges is defined by the term white supremacy. We talked about that. We use the term to capture the magnitude and normalcy of white privilege, dominance, and assumed superiority. So the idea that it's normal, that whiteness is normal and anything else is abnormal. So for example, standard English that would use a European American speech pattern is considered the standard. But actually in the United States, our English is far inferior to British English. But yet we have American English, white English as the standard. Or like the cartoons or the children's books is a good example. Most children's books you see today, they include Caucasian characters. Most cartoons you see today include it's a European American world, but that's not really reflective of reality because Americans come in all shapes and sizes. But the norm is considered to be European American. White supremacy is in the global context. White supremacy in the global context. Power is not dependent on numbers, but on position. So, for example, in Africa, you can. That's why we use the word minoritized group. In Africa, black folks are the numerical majority, but they still are in a minority position of power. They don't have the power. They don't have the institutional power. Movies, mass media, corporate culture, advertising, and Christian missionary work allows white supremacy to circulate in a global context. That is, when you see advertising, when you see even missionary work, they're not necessarily preaching Christ. They're not necessarily preaching the word of God. They're preaching sometimes white values, especially you saw in the 19th century. You had people, they were telling Native Americans to cut their hair and speak English and dress in a Western way. That's the idea that European culture is superior. And it's not necessarily so. One example is of the legacy of white supremacy is partitioning of territories in accordance to colonial white Western powers' interests. What I mean by that is to arbitrarily go to Africa, and this happened, and carve up territory based on what European Americans think should be boundaries. But in reality, they made a mess of things because they split boundaries where people spoke different languages, or people spoke the same language. And they just split it in half arbitrarily. And so you can study that on your own in terms of, it's called the rape of Africa. There's some writing on that. Sociologists use the term white supremacy when describing those who differ from us or European American. When I say us, not I'm an African American, but when we think about whiteness as normal, we say that countries are uncivilized when they're not Western. So when we say third world countries, they mean African or South American, black and brown folks. In the first world is European countries, the Western way of life. So I want you to think about that. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about white privilege. We've already talked about that a few chapters back, but you notice the Band-Aids here. Generally, especially in my day when I was growing up, we could not, this is an example of white privilege, we could not find Band-Aids that matched our skin tone because most of the Band-Aids are designed for a European American person. And it was very difficult to find a brown Band-Aid that matched my skin tone. That's an example of white privilege. It might seem small, but privilege is being able to go to the store and buy a Band-Aid or bandages that match your skin tone somewhat. So, somewhat match. So, and this is what I was getting at in terms of white privilege. So white privilege, as I said in a few chapters back, it's not that you're so privileged that you have everything was ever handed to you, because many people in the classroom, you work really hard for where you are, and I understand that, but that has nothing to do with white privilege. I can, for example, if I wish, arrange to be in the company of people of my race most of the time. I can avoid spending time with people whom I was trained to mistrust, who will have learned to mistrust my kind or me. And I've talked about this before. If I should need to move, I can be pretty sure of renting or purchasing housing in an area which I can afford, in which I would want to live. And this is by Peggy McIntosh. I can be pretty sure that my neighbors in such a location will be neutral or pleasant to me. Like one time I remember when I first moved I live in a predominantly Caucasian suburb right now, European American. And the first night we moved in, the neighbors didn't recognize us as a European American man. He came out with a gun and confronted us, and it was kind of messed up, But sometimes we laugh things off because we've experienced it for a lifetime. So this was our house we had just purchased some time ago, and the neighbor came out. We moved in at night. The neighbor came out with a gun and was threatening us, and it was our own house because we were black. I have a big family. There's an idea that black people are threatening, especially if they're in large numbers. I can go shopping alone most of the time, pretty well sure that I would not be followed or harassed. I've been there, done that. I've been followed and harassed quite a bit as an African American person. I can turn on the television or open to the front page of the paper and see people of my race widely represented. When I am told about our national heritage or about civilization, I am shown that people of my color made it what it is. I can be sure that my children will be given curricular materials that testify to the existence of their race. And that's what I was talking about. For example, children's books predominantly portray European American folks. I can be pretty sure of having my voice heard in a group, which I am the only member. So that's just some ideas of white privilege, and we talked about that before, as I said. So these are some misconceptions that I really like this Senso and D'Angelo in the text. They highlight some major misconceptions. Why can't we all just be human? Is it this focus on race that divides us? How are we all how are we the same? How are we different? And so that's the idea. So a European American can easily say that because race doesn't affect them every single day of their life. But a person like myself, as an African American professor, when I'm pulled over by the police because I'm an African American, or even on my own campus, when I was harassed by the police because of the color of my skin, or when I was in school and I wouldn't be doing anything and I was harassed by the teacher because of my color, just different kinds of things and scenarios that I've been in that it was obvious because of the color of my skin, or my uncle being harassed by the Klan and being brutalized by the Klan because he was a black man. Just on and on and on. I've been pulled over at the store. One time I was not pulled over at the store, but I was in the parking lot coming back from work as a teenager, as an African American youth, and I was coming back from work and going towards my car, and I was apprehended in the mall parking lot because I looked like I fit the description, and they took me back into the security room and was drilling me and saying that somebody said I was breaking into a car. So how can I sit up there and say, well, let's treat everybody like humans? That's very noble, but if you're going through that, you won't really say that if that's something you're going through. But I like these pictures, though, because it shows sort of racially ambiguous people. It shows that people come in all shapes and sizes. So we can celebrate our differences, but also we can celebrate our similarities. And I really agree with that, however, too. I have a friend who's a person of color, which shows that I'm not racist. Racism isn't only something that individual people do, but it's a system. Schools, for example, systematically privilege European American folks, European American values, systemic racism. So don't think about it individually, because you might say, well, I'm not a racist. I don't have those thoughts. But look at it globally. That's one of the things I want you to get from this class. Having people of color in your life is important, but does not in and of itself end white supremacy in the wider culture that shapes you. Deal with your relationships. Friendships alone aren't enough to overcome all of our socialization. Whites still experience white privilege, and maintain institutional control. Even if you have friends, even if you're married, I have relatives that are in interracial relationships, and I love my in-laws. I have some European American white women in-laws. My brother, two of my brothers are one of my brothers is married to a European American woman, and then two of my sisters are married to European American men, and we're best of friends with family. But that doesn't exempt my sisters and my brother from experiencing racism. My sister has relatively darkly complected skin, so people treat her a certain type of way because of her skin tone. So just because she's married, you get that? Just because she's married to a European American man does not mean she doesn't experience racism. In the same way, just because you have black friends doesn't mean that your privilege disappears. Having a friend of color does not mean you are educated on the complexity of racism. And so that comes from sitting down, talking to people, experiencing it with them, etc. and so forth. I went to school with a lot of people of color. In fact, I was the minority in my school. This is a common misconception. The settings that appear culturally diverse for whites do not always appear this way for people of color. So, for example, a European American person might be in a classroom where there's 3 African Americans. You say my classroom is diverse, whereas the African American person is looking like it's only 3 of us in here total. I'm still uncomfortable. Many times there'll be one African American person in your classroom. You'll say our classroom was somewhat diverse. We had a black guy in it. But that individual most likely feels uncomfortable, because often that was me. I can speak for I could speak on that as an African American person. White people who had childhood friends of color rarely keep them because schools, workplace, and other environments channel us in different directions. That's very true. I had some European American friends all through high school, here and there. We played basketball together. We did things together. We went out together, hung out in the mall. I don't talk to any of those individuals, and I reach out to them, but they just don't speak to me anymore because they have different lifestyles, different ways of life. There was a friend that was over my house every single day, but he just drifted away from me. And that's what I mean by that. Most schools are still segregated within schools, mirroring the racial segregation of our wider society. Another misconception: people of color are too sensitive. They play the race card. This is really a way to disseminate the argument and not even deal with it. I think it's an arrogant statement because you're not a person of color, so you don't really know what people of color are going through. It's easy for a European American to say that because that means they don't have to deal with it. But these claims are false. It's racial arrogance at best. Racial arrogance at best. Dismiss rather than learn. These individuals, they rather dismiss it and even worse, berate people of color than even try to learn what's going on. Racially subliminally, reinforced subliminally. These ideas are reinforced subtly. That's what I'm trying to say. And then this outright denial. These are the characteristics that people that make this statement exhibit. So I like this here, based on the Monopoly game piece. The race card is a tool of the intellectually weak and lazy when they cannot counter a logical argument or factual data. A tool of the intellectually weak and lazy when they cannot counter a logical argument or factual data. And that's kind of the definition of it. That's how it's used. That's how it's perceived. But also you could say this is what people say when they can't really come up with an argument for race or when they can't come up with an argument against racism. There's a parody here. It might be a little bit offensive to you. That's not the idea of it, but please watch it with a grain of salt. But I think it's hilarious in terms of how it makes fun of people that talk about the race card. The race card is this idea that African Americans use their color to get unfair advantages. It just doesn't exist. So I want you to check that out. Common misconceptions. This is just political correctness. Charges of political correctness often emerge when people are being forced to acknowledge racism. Political correctness originated as a term to describe language, ideas, policies, and behaviors that seek to minimize social and institutional oppression. As soon as the term political correctness surfaces, discussions end because nobody wants to be accused of PC. So again, it emerges when people are forced to acknowledge racism. These are things that challenge us, and I want you to think about this. You don't have to be defensive. It's not about, remember this class not being about being right or wrong. It's about growing as a person. People of color are just as racist as we are. In fact, now there's reverse racism and white people can't get into college or get good jobs. First of all, there's a lot of factual errors there. If African Americans had an unfair advantage, classrooms like ours would be 50% or more racially diverse, but as it stands, we probably only have about 3 or 4 people of color in the class. And in my classes, my in-person classes, I have 2 classes that are 100% African American, 100% European American. No diversity in my class. And so if it was the case that African Americans had unfair advantages in scholarships and all these things, places like Ivy League schools, Harvard, Princeton, any average campus will be overrun with people of color, but that's not the case. It's a myth that people of color have an unfair disadvantage. By the way, people of color is a new sociological term that's really came about the last 15 or 20 years. It's different from saying colored. Colored is outdated. I know it's kind of a funny thing. Like, what's the difference between saying colored and people of color? Colored is a loaded term, and it's been used derogatorily in the past. So that's different for people of color. people of color is socially acceptable. Racism is not merely racial prejudice. It is racial prejudice that's backed by institutional power. Okay, so that would challenge the idea of reverse racism. Power relations do not move back and forth. One day benefiting one group, next day the other. Because African Americans, when they're prejudiced, they don't have an institutional power, historical power and privilege to back them up. For example, we've only had one biracial U.S. president, an extremely limited diversity in Congress and the Supreme Court. Whites have had a hard time believing that people of color could have gotten a job or accepted into the college based on their qualifications alone. This is the kicker, and I want you to think about this. Many European Americans feel entitled to all of the desirable positions. So if they didn't get into college, and they see another African American there, they say, oh, that person got in because they're black. And they're kind of feeling some other type of way about it because they wanted that position. But as long as it's like apple picking and picking peaches and picking fruit in the construction, the laborer construction jobs, European American folks don't complain about that. But when it comes to something that they desire, they feel entitled to it. And they're resentful often. Not everybody, but some folks are resentful when they see African Americans in a higher position than them. I get it all the time as a professor. People assume that I'm a professor because I somehow benefited from affirmative action, or because I'm black, or I teach all classes on race. In fact, my official title is Associate Professor of Social Studies Education and History. I'm a historian, and I teach all of the social studies classes, social studies methods classes on campus. That's what I was hired for. I like teaching the race classes. I actually asked to teach the class on race, but that's not why they hired me. People may assume that. So here's another video. I didn't mention the last one. Go back a couple of slides. Oh, I did mention that, the one on the race card, but I want you to watch this one as well. On reverse racism, there'll be a space online as usual on Canvas that you can click on it. This is a really good talk about reverse racism, a short clip that'll explain why reverse racism is not a thing. Until next time, I'll talk to you later. Have a good day. Let me know if you have questions. Bye.